Today I want us to talk about presentation skills. I think it's one of the most common challenges that we all have faced. I tend to ask people, when do you remember the last time you sat in a PowerPoint presentation and you are not bored? I think 80% of the time when you start seeing a slide being put up or being projected, the greatest fear is that by the time you're on slide number 20, half the time your mind is already switched off and you're thinking about other things. So why is it so difficult to really grasp the concept of preparing presentations in such a way that you captivate the audience? And I want to take you back. I remember when we were young and we were growing up, before the age of digital transformation, we literally used to write letters and post them on a mailbox. And most of you remember the very first time that you had a crush and you would write a love letter. Now, just imagine if you wrote a love letter and then you address it to whom it may concern. Does it really make sense? Of course it doesn't. And that is unfortunately what most people tend to do with PowerPoint presentations. I mean, they prepare a presentation and it's not specific exactly to the audience that you're intending to focus on. And often you will start the presentation and by the time you're in slide number 10, there's already a disconnect between you and the audience. And it's amazing. How is it that when you're having a conversation with somebody and you're speaking, face to face, hardly do you find people falling asleep? Yet when they are doing PowerPoint presentations, I can say most of the time, we do feel like falling asleep. You're struggling, you stand up, you go to the washrooms, you go and wash your face and then you come back and you just still feel like that presentation in itself is like a strong dose of some sleep medication. Again, it really goes back to the very common mistakes that we tend to do when we are preparing PowerPoint presentation. And that's what I really want to talk about today. What are these common mistakes that we tend to do? Now, number one, which is important, is that we forget who the star of the presentation is. The star of the presentation is never the presenter, but actually the audience. And you find that most presenters tend to focus on making themselves the center of attraction. Yet when you're preparing a presentation, the person that you're really focusing on is actually your audience. Which of course takes me to the second point, that you then need to be able to understand and segment who are my audience. Who am I going to be speaking to? What is the most common thread across this audience? How connected am I to this audience? Am I a guest speaker in this presentation? Is it my colleagues I'm presenting to? Is it a mix of people that maybe we work with? Do we have the same religious following, for example? I think that is really important, because if you look at the structure of what you're going to be presenting, by being able to understand your audience, you can be able to tailor the message that you want to be able to communicate. Of course, the third point, which is important, is that you really need to ask yourself, how can I be able to begin with the bang? Again, I want to demystify the fact that the more filled your slides or your PowerPoint presentation, the more likely your audience will get engaged. In fact, what we have seen is that people can only be able to read up to about 250 words per minute. And unfortunately, most of the slides that we tend to see are filled with much more than that. And of course, it's not surprising that people get disconnected. So you want to actually be able to start your key message and be able to make sure that you can connect to the audience right from the start. What's a big idea that you're trying to communicate? What do you want the audience to do with the message you're trying to pass across? So once you have been able to understand your audience, you need to structure your big idea. A very common suggestion that we tend to give, which is going to be my third point, is that you can be able to take people from what is the current situation and what could be. Remember, every time you're making a presentation, you're trying to get a certain behavior or outcome, for that matter, from the particular audience. So if you're not going to be able to meet that, you tend to lose that opportunity. And again, and I know we've said this before, people tend to only be alert for up to a maximum of 20 minutes. So you want to be able to make sure that not only your presentation is structured so that you can optimize on the time available, but that you can be able to get people being alert and concentrating and being able to remember the key messages at least within that particular time. So the other rule of thumb that you want to remember is that if you've been given 30 minutes to present, prepare your presentation to be about 20 minutes. Always remember that most likely by the time you are 60% of your slides, half your audience will already have disconnected. So you want to be able to have that in mind when you're preparing. Now the other thing is that people tend to relate to stories. I think from generation to generation, what we tend to remember the most are things that we can be able to relate to. So as much as possible when you're doing your PowerPoint presentation, try and put in stories that people can be able to relate to. You know, you introduce them as part of your presentation so that you can create a connection that people can walk away with. Because what you want to see is that at the end of the presentation, they will be able to remember something about that presentation. And again, nowadays with technology, we have so many options in terms of what you can be able to use. So having a break in between where you introduce either videos, you introduce maybe charts or other audio visual techniques that you can be able to use may help you to drive across your message. What you certainly don't want to do is to have too much jargon in your presentation, because people will disconnect with that. And what we have seen is that the more complex a presentation, the more likely that people will be thinking about something else when you're presenting. And you don't want that. I think people tend to make the assumption that when you have a PowerPoint presentation, that people will be forced to listen. Again, people tend to focus more on the body language, and that's what really I want to be able to emphasize today. That if you're going to be powerful when you're doing your PowerPoint presentation, number one, like we said, remember the star of the presentation is the audience, it's not the presenter. Number two, you have to be cognizant of who are the type of audience that you have. What's the big idea you're trying to be able to sell? How can you be able to structure your slides so that people can be able to see stories come alive in your presentation? As much as possible, the fewer the words, but the more the powerful message you're trying to communicate, the more likely that people will really be able to remember your presentation. I cannot possibly be able to cover everything, but I'd like to urge you to be able to join us in some of our training sessions and be able to learn how can you become better at doing powerful presentations. And again, it's not about how much talking can be able to do, but it's how much people can remember the message that you're trying to pass across. I hope that you'll be able to remember this. I hope that this has been a great session for you, and it just passes on the very important key message about preparing well with your audience in mind when it comes to making powerful presentations. Thank you so much, and see you next time.